Hello, my good people. How are you? I hope you're doing well. This is Kate Munyoki once more. For those who do not know me, yeah. So, without wastage of time, let me introduce you to whatever I'm going to be taking you through. We're actually going to be talking about the earthquakes. Yeah, it might not be new to some of you. I know you've ever heard of them. So I want to begin my introduction by trying to define actually what is earthquake. So when we talk about earthquake, we're simply talking about the shaking, or trembling of the rocks of the earth surface, simply as a result of the shock waves. Yeah, as a result of the waves, we call them shock waves. Yeah. So I'm saying I want to begin by defining what is the earthquakes. And when you talk about the earthquakes, actually, we're simply talking about the shaking or trembling of the rocks of the earth surface as a result of the shock waves which originate below the earth surface. This kind of the waves, actually, they originate below the earth surface. So I want to say, allow me to say this, that the shock waves are usually released when the masses of the rock below the earth surface break. When we have masses of the rocks, more rocks here below the earth surface breaking, either as a result of being pushed towards each other, we're likely to have an energy which is released, and this kind of the energy we're calling it the shock waves, and they are the ones which are responsible for the shaking of the rocks of the surface of the earth. So something else you need to know, we've been told that this movement actually, it may be so severe, it might be so severe that it can cause some dangerous damages or some visible changes on the earth surface, or most of the times actually the movement are not such severe, so they might only be felt by people, hence they may not cause some destruction. So when we're talking about earthquakes, actually, it's actually very important to understand that there are some terms we need to know whenever we're talking about it, yeah? So some of the terms we're going to talk about the shock waves, as we had mentioned earlier. We also talk about the earth tremors. We also talk about the seismic focus. We're also going to talk about the epicenter. And basically I think those are the terms we need to know when you talk about the earthquake. So I've earlier said that when you talk about the earth, the seismic or the shock waves, they are actually the waves which originate below the earth surface, and they usually, we have actually talked about the seismic waves or the shock waves, and we've said they are actually the waves which cause the shaking of the rocks of the surface of the earth, and they actually originate from below the earth surface. The other term I've said we're supposed to talk about the earth tremors. Actually, we have a difference between the earthquakes and the earth tremors. When you talk about the earth tremors, actually, they are the kind of the mild earthquakes, M-I-L-D, the mild earthquakes. Meaning that they kind of the earthquakes which are likely to be felt by the people, but their impact, or they do not cause any destruction. If in case we have some destruction, maybe they are minor. So the kind of the earthquakes, actually we call them the earth tremors, and I've said the earth tremors actually it is the mild earthquakes. The other term is supposed to know actually it is the seismic focus. When you talk about the seismic focus, we've said earlier, we've talked about the seismic waves, the shock waves, and we say they originate below the earth surface. So when you talk about the seismic focus, we're simply talking about the point whereby the shock waves usually originate, some kilometers below the earth surface, yeah? That point where the shock waves usually originate, we call it the seismic focus. The last term which we're supposed to go through with you, actually it's epicenter. Epicenter, it is usually that point. We've talked about the seismic waves, originating from the seismic focus. So these shock waves, whenever they originate from the seismic focus, they usually travel outward. So that particular point on the earth surface, where the seismic waves originate, not originate, whereby it's directly above the ground. It is what we call the epicenter. I'm talking about that particular point whereby whenever the shock waves travel outward from the seismic focus, whenever they travel outward, that particular point whereby they directly hit on the surface of the earth, it's what we call the epicenter. We simply say it is where the shock waves first hit the earth surface. The particular point, the first point whereby the shock waves usually hit the earth surface is where we call the epicenter. We say it is where the earthquakes is first felt, that is on the earth surface. The first point, the first place, the area whereby the shock waves are usually experienced, that is the point we call the epicenter. Yeah, so I believe I'm going to show that. So I'm actually talking about this point. So at this point is where we call the seismic focus, actually, where the shock waves originate. And then they try to travel outward to this point, which we call epicenter. Epicenter here. I hope maybe I was clear enough. I'm not sure. Yeah, that way. Sorry. Okay, yeah, you can see the seismic focus that is down here, yeah, and then they try to travel outward. So the first point where these shock waves usually hit, actually at this point, this is where we call the epicenter. Yeah, so that is it. So from there, my good learners, we're supposed to talk about the causes of the earthquakes. Yeah, what causes the shaking or trembling of the rocks on the earth surface? Of course, we have some causes of the earthquakes, and we're going to divide the causes of the earthquakes into two. That is the natural causes, and we're also going to have some human causes. So to begin with, I'm actually going to begin with the natural causes. Yeah, what do you think are some of the causes? What do you think are some of the natural causes, my good learners? So some of the natural causes of the earthquakes, it's actually the tectonic movement. The tectonic movement. I know this is not something new. Yeah, the tectonic movement actually. So when you talk about natural causes, I've said natural cause number one is actually tectonic movement. This is not the first time we're talking about the tectonic movement. We said it's a theory whereby it deals with the movement of the plates. We say the Earth's crust or the asthenosphere is actually made up of different plates, the major plates and the minor plates. I'm very sure you can remember that. So when you talk about one of the natural causes of the earthquakes being a tectonic movement, we simply say that when the plates actually try to slide past each other, we're likely to have a lot of energy being released, and that energy actually makes the crust rocks or the rocks of the surface of the earth simply to shake. So some of the areas whereby earthquakes, the kind of the earthquakes being experienced there as a result of plate tectonic movement is actually in Japan. Japan actually experiences the earthquakes as a result of the plates trying to move past each other. I'm not sure specifically which plate and which plate, though we can talk about it later. The other cause of the earthquakes. The other natural cause actually is isostatic adjustment. You remember we talked about the causes of the earth movement. So this is not the first time you getting to hear these terms. So when you talk about the isostatic adjustments, we're simply talking about the balance that simply exists between the continental crust and the oceanic crust, if you can remember that. Yeah, so we're saying that whenever the continental crust is trying to adjust itself with the oceanic crust, of course, we're likely to have some shaking or trembling of the rocks of the earth surface. We've been told most of the parts of Canada, actually, they usually record unnoticed earthquakes, which usually result from the adjustments of the crust, simply due to the loss of the weight of the glaciers that once covered large parts of the region. When you talk about glacier, we're simply talking about moving ice, the frozen water, whereby it begins to slide or to move. So due to reduction of the weight which was exerted on the continental crust, we likely to have some adjustment, whereby this leads to the to the earthquakes. The other one is about gravitational pressure. I'm very sure this is not the first time you're getting to hear this. We talked about gravitational pressure, whereby we said it's actually the force which pulls all the objects towards the center of the earth. So after we have had some volcanicity, I don't know whether I've talked about volcanicity, I'm not sure, but if I've not talked about it, actually I'll talk about it. So when you talk about gravitational pressure, we're simply talking about whenever we have some magma escaping from the layer of the upper mantle, squeezing itself through the crust so that it can reach on the surface of the earth, we're likely to have some voids, some spaces which have been left there. So the work of gravitational pressure actually is to pull the upper rocks to try to replace the space which has been left there, the hollows. And during that time, when we are trying to have some vertical movements, actually we're likely to have some shaking of the rocks of the earth's surface. The other cause of the earthquakes, which I had not talked about, actually is the volcanicity. And we usually say, how does volcanicity cause earthquakes? We said when the magma, almost a molten material, is trying to force itself on the surface of the earth, actually it's likely to push the rocks, the crustal rocks, leading to some shaking of the rocks of the surface of the earth. Yeah, we still have some human causes of the earthquakes, my good learners. I don't know, I'm not sure whether we're going to cover it today. Let me check the length of my video, and then maybe we can continue with the human causes as we conclude.